In her lecture, Diane Ravitch addresses a variety of issues she finds with the education reformation over the past 40 years. While her supported policies previously aligned with conservative views, she now takes a much more liberal stance in her recent works. After listening to Diane's lecture, I believe that her ideologic shift to a more progressive stance has presented very insightful perspectives on current policy issues. 4 policy issues addressed by Ravitch that I will be analyzing in this presentation are the privatization of education through the influence of big businesses, the misuse and inequity of standardized testing, the influence of poverty on student and school achievement, and the use of required national standards. One of the first policy topics Ravitch addresses is the privatization of schools and the negative effects of it. Ravitch rejects the privatization of schools by explaining that instead of leaning on the funds and influence of big businesses and allowing them to privatize schools, a better approach is to improve schools by addressing inequities created by poverty. By allowing these foundations and organizations to provide funds for schools, we are giving more control to big businesses to make the decisions surrounding policy and education. Furthermore, as she mentions in her lecture, many of these businesses end up becoming the management system for many charter schools, allowing them to run the school just like a business operation, putting money first, not the students. Many studies show that opening more and more schools is also not an effective type of reform. Conservatives often think that the bureaucracies of public schools are why they are failing, and if these bureaucracies are eliminated by opening a privately run school, the school will perform better. This, however, is not the case. In fact, many believe that the problems in lower achieving schools have deep roots in unequal funding. Many liberal analysts agree that if we want to improve schools, a better solution is to address the poverty in these school neighborhoods rather than throw money at school reforms. Ravitch also argues that school choice schools typically have the ability to pick and choose who enrolls, which further segregates these schools. She's not the only one who believes this. In fact, the OECD found that when examining multiple school countries' school choice systems, the most successful systems aren't the ones that pin public and private schools against each other. The OECD also states that schools of choice should be accessible to all, meaning that students cannot be accepted based on designated criteria. They also explain that successful systems of school choice should not aim to remove a student from a failing school, but rather provide them with an equal but alternative setting. In other words, a nation should work to make all schools successful so that a student isn't missing out on an education based on the school that they attend. Another policy that Ravitch addresses is the misuse and inequity of standardized tests. Instead of using standardized tests as a way to measure achievement and performance, Ravitch argues that the only place standardized tests have in education are as being used as a diagnostic tool. If we want to measure student growth, we should follow the footsteps of other countries and use different methods such as teacher-developed assessments to measure achievement. Ravitch believes that as a nation we are misusing standardized testing. It was not meant to be used as a motivator or a means of measuring knowledge and success. Our country has essentially made it the sole indicator of academic achievement, which was not the intention. In fact, by focusing solely on preparing students to achieve high scores on these assessments, many students are getting a shallow education and only gaining surface-level knowledge. Ravitch, as well as other researchers, also bring up the fact that standardized tests essentially just reiterate demographics and socioeconomic status of students. While the makers of these assessments work to eliminate testing bias, they don't take into account the baggage some students are taking the test with. For example, these tests don't account for the deficits that students from low-income families enter school with, but instead highlight it against their affluent peers when these low-income students score significantly lower on the assessment. Ravitch also acknowledges that the successful education system of Finland. In Finland, basic knowledge is not assessed using standardized tests. Instead, teachers are given assessment guidelines, asked to create the assessments themselves, and then use those assessments to collect progress data on students. This system also focuses on encouraging students to take control of their learning and focuses strongly on developing self-assessment skills, so students can identify when they get something and when they need extra support on their own. While Finland has not eliminated standardized testing completely, as they do take some at the end of their schooling upon entering post-secondary education, They have developed a much healthier relationship with it and have found a much more teacher-driven, student-centered approach to monitoring what students are learning. In Ravage's lecture, she also addresses the influence of poverty on student and school achievement. Ravage argues that schools themselves don't necessarily need reform, but instead, the best way to improve schools is to address poverty. Ravage explains that the greatest influence on school performance is family income, parental involvement, and medical care. She agrees that yes, teachers have influence on students, but it typically isn't enough influence to overcome the detrimental effects that living in poverty or low-income areas can have on students. And Ravage isn't the only one to make this claim. Many studies have proven that living in poverty can negatively affect how students perform in school. NEA explains that of the factors that contribute to the achievement gap, many components come from factors that schools cannot control. Studies have shown that families' income level, students' birth weight, students' diet and nutrition at home, and the primary language spoken at home can all impact how a student performs in school, and it affects the deficits that they may have when they enter school. In low-income areas, students may not have access to nutritional foods at home, and they may not have the ability to get routine medical care. Furthermore, mothers may not have the ability to get necessary prenatal care or afford academically rich childcare. All of these are factors that can influence how students perform once they get to school. Child Fund goes further with the impact of poverty on education by stating that poverty reduces a child's readiness for school because it leads to poor physical health and motor skills. It diminishes a child's ability to concentrate and remember information, and it reduces attentiveness, curiosity, and motivation. Students are entering school behind, and the gap only grows as they progress further through the system. Child Fund also explains that the United States has one of the highest rates of poverty globally, which could explain the poor rankings of the United States when compared to other education systems globally. Like Ravage explains in her lecture, if we want to improve schools, the best chance we have at doing this is by addressing poverty. A final policy that Ravage addresses in her lecture is the use of required national standards. While Ravage was once a supporter of these during the No Child Left Behind, she now takes a more liberal stance and believes that schools should instead focus on tasks that can't be put into a national standard, like creativity, critical thinking, the arts, and basically just developing a love for learning. Ravage supports her thinking by explaining that the Common Core standards have been adopted without any field test, so we really have no idea how these standards can impact the education that students receive. In her lecture, she also explains that the standards were rolled out in a hasty manner, with just the goal of getting them ready specifically for the election. Like her other views, Ravage isn't the only one who finds fault with the requirement of national standards. Literacy specialist Rebecca Alber explains that as teachers, the requirement of national standards can be problematic because it can become the main focus of what is taught in schools, which results in surface-level learning and a push just to get through the content. Alber goes on to say that as teachers, we don't really teach standards. We teach children. Standards are simply guidelines. Just as Ravage explains, standards should be a guideline. The mastery of them shouldn't be the sole indicator of academic achievement, and the designated standards should not be the sole focus of what is taught and assessed in schools. Instead, standards should act as guidelines for what should be taught in schools. Curriculum should be adapted for the specific students in each classroom to make it relevant and engaging for all. Furthermore, just like Ravage suggests, schools should also focus their attention on instilling habits and skills that cannot just be captured with a written standard. During her lecture, Diane Ravage offered multiple perspectives on the current reforms in education and offered suggestions on how we should actually be addressing these issues. Ravage's ideologies are liberal in nature, but are also focused on helping to create a system better for students, teachers, and society. While some may discredit Ravage for her changing views over time, I believe that this shows that her passion for education reform goes beyond just a political game, as it is for many policymakers. She truly wants what's best for students. In an interview, Ravage explains where she envisions education reform going, and I believe her words can offer insight for all educators and policymakers regardless of their political stance. She states that we should build and sustain the kind of schools that create the society we want to live in.